In the busy city of Tembra, Aaliyah believed she had found the life every woman dreamed of. She had married Jamari, a man who looked like the perfect husband in everyone's eyes. He was handsome, well-spoken, and carried himself with charm that made neighbors admire them as a couple. Whenever they walked down the street together, people smiled and whispered about how lucky Aaliyah was. They had just started building their new home, they dressed well, and the biggest joy of all, Aaliyah was carrying their first child. She would often place her hand on her growing belly, imagining the little heartbeat inside her, and Jamari would sometimes rest his hand there too, playing the part of a proud father-to-be in front of others. To the outside world, theirs was a picture of happiness, a perfect love story unfolding in real time. Aaliyah herself wanted to believe it. She told her friends that her husband was caring, that he loved her deeply, and that her future was safe. She dreamed of raising her child in laughter, peace, and warmth. To everyone watching, Aaliyah's life sparkled like a dream. But deep inside the walls of their home, a different truth was waiting to be revealed. Do you want me to continue and expand part 2, The Cracks Behind Closed Doors, 200 to 300 words? In the same tone? Behind the smiles and the laughter people saw, Aaliyah was living a very different reality. Jamari, the man everyone respected, was not the same man she faced when the doors of their home closed. His voice, once sweet, had turned sharp. His words, once filled with promises, now carried poison. He would snap over the smallest things: a meal that wasn't warm enough, a shirt not ironed the way he liked, or even just a question Aaliyah asked. At first, she told herself he was stressed, that it was just temporary, that all marriages had challenges. She tried harder to please him, hoping the man she had fallen in love with would come back. But instead, Jamari grew colder. His anger wasn't just in his words anymore. It showed in his hands. Aaliyah felt it in the sudden grip of his fingers on her arm, the shove when she tried to defend herself, the slap that left her heart shaking more than her cheek. Still, she hid the truth. When neighbors asked how she was, she smiled and said, "I'm fine." When her mother called, she spoke of love and excitement for the baby. She wanted so badly to believe her own lies. At night, she would place her hand on her stomach and whisper to her unborn child, "It's okay, Mama is here. I'll protect you." Yet in her heart she was afraid. Afraid of Jamari's temper, afraid of what would happen next, afraid that the love she once thought was real had turned into a cage she couldn't escape. The world saw Jamari as a perfect husband, but Aaliyah knew the truth. She was living with a man whose charm outside was nothing but a mask hiding the monster within. Do you want me to go ahead and write part 3, The Day Love Turned into Fear, 350 words? Next, in the same powerful emotional style? It was a quiet evening in Tembra, and Aaliyah had cooked Jamari's favorite meal, hoping it would ease the tension that had been growing between them. She placed the food carefully on the table, her swollen feet aching from standing too long. But instead of appreciation, Jamari frowned. The stew was not hot enough. That small complaint was all it took for his temper to burst like fire. His voice grew louder, his words turned cruel, and before Aaliyah could explain, his hand slammed against the table. Her heart raced. She tried to calm him, reminding him gently that she was carrying his child, that stress wasn't good for the baby. But Jamari didn't care. His pride was wounded, and his rage demanded an outlet. He stood over her, his shadow swallowing her small frame. Then, without a thought for the life inside her, his fists replaced the sweet promises he had once made. Blow after blow, he struck the woman who loved him, the woman who trusted him, the mother of his unborn child. Aaliyah cried out, begging him to stop, but her voice was drowned out by his anger. Her hands clutched her stomach as if her arms could shield the innocent heartbeats inside her. Every strike was not just against her body, but against the fragile world she had dreamed of building. When he finally stopped, Aaliyah was lying on the floor, her body trembling, her breath broken. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered prayers, not for herself but for her baby. She no longer cared about the bruises, the pain, or her own safety. Her only fear was whether the little life inside her had survived the storm of his cruelty. That night, love disappeared, and in its place, fear took root in Aaliyah's heart forever. Do you want me to move ahead and expand part 4? The Woman Who Couldn't Stand, 350 words. In the same dramatic and emotional flow? Aaliyah lay crumpled on the cold floor, her body refusing to obey her. Every part of her ached, her ribs screamed with pain, her arms felt heavy, and her legs trembled as though they no longer belonged to her. She tried to push herself up, but her strength betrayed her. All she could do was lie there, staring at the ceiling, her breath shallow, her tears rolling silently down her face. The room was quiet now, but the silence was more terrifying than the shouting. It pressed against her ears, reminding her that she was alone in her suffering. Her hands instinctively wrapped around her stomach. "Please, my babies, please hold on," she whispered in a trembling voice. She wasn't thinking about herself anymore. Her only fear was for the tiny lives inside her, too innocent to know the cruelty of the world. Every beat of her heart was a prayer, every tear a desperate plea for them to survive what she had endured. She tried to call out for help, but her voice came out weak, broken, almost swallowed by the very walls that had trapped her pain for so long. In that moment, Aaliyah realized how fragile she had become. The strong woman who once dreamed of raising her child in love was lying shattered on the floor, unable to stand, unable to escape. She thought of her mother, of how she had once warned her that love should never hurt. She thought of the neighbors who admired their perfect marriage, never knowing what was happening just beyond the closed doors. A deep sadness washed over her, not just for herself, but for the truth she had hidden so well. As the night dragged on, Aaliyah's eyes grew heavy, but she forced herself to stay awake. She whispered again to her unborn child, promising, "Mama will protect you. We will survive this." And though her body was broken, her spirit clung tightly to the hope that tomorrow might bring help, that tomorrow might bring light into the darkness threatening to consume her. "Do you want me to continue with part 5, the ride to the..." The faint sound of Aaliyah's cries slipped through the cracks of her walls and reached the ears of her neighbors. At first, they thought it was nothing, perhaps a bad dream or the usual sounds of a couple arguing. But then the cry came again, weaker this time and filled with pain. It was enough to send them running. When they pushed the door open, what they saw made their hearts sink. Aaliyah was lying on the floor, her face pale, her body trembling, one hand tightly wrapped around her stomach. Her lips moved, but her voice was so faint they could barely hear her. Without a second thought, 2 women and a man lifted her carefully, whispering words of comfort she was too weak to answer. Her body felt almost lifeless in their arms, but her eyes opened just enough to reveal the tears that refused to stop. They rushed her into a neighbor's car, every bump on the road making her flinch with pain. She kept her hands pressed against her belly, as though she could shield the little lives inside from the cruelty she had endured. "Mama is here. Please, please stay with me," she whispered over and over, her voice barely audible. She didn't care about the bruises covering her body or the blood at the corner of her lips. All that mattered was the tiny heartbeats within her. Her thoughts raced with fear. What if the baby didn't make it? What if the violence had stolen away the only light left in her life? The car raced through the streets of Tembra, its headlights cutting through the night until Mukuru General Hospital came into view. Nurses rushed out as soon as the car stopped, placing Aaliyah on a stretcher, their voices urgent and commanding. As the doors to the emergency room swung shut behind her, her eyes fluttered, heavy with exhaustion. The last thing she managed to whisper before the world faded around her was a fragile prayer. "Please let my baby live." "Do you want me to go ahead and write part 6? The doctor's urgent face, 350 words. In the same emotional and Jamari paced back and forth in the waiting area, his face twisted into a mask of fake concern. He straightened his shirt, tapped his foot impatiently, and sighed loudly as if he were the one being wronged. To the few people sitting nearby, he looked like a worried husband, but inside, Jamari was convinced this would all blow over. He thought the doctor would come out, scold him lightly, maybe warn him to be careful, because his wife was pregnant, and then let him take Aaliyah home. In his mind, everything would return to silence, the same silence he had forced upon her for months. But when the doctor finally appeared, the air in the room shifted. His face carried the weight of something heavy, something that couldn't be softened. He didn't walk slowly. He rushed in, his coat still swinging behind him, his eyes sharp and urgent. Jamari froze. The false confidence he wore so proudly began to crack the moment their eyes met. The doctor's expression was not one of annoyance or routine concern. It was grave, almost angry, and it sent a chill running down the spines of everyone present. Jamari forced a smile and asked, "She's fine, right? Just a little weak." But the doctor didn't smile back. Instead, his voice cut through the room with a seriousness that silenced even the distant chatter of nurses. He explained that Aaliyah had been brought in bruised, weak, and barely holding on. He said her body had endured something no pregnant woman should ever face, and every second had been a fight to keep her alive. The doctor's eyes didn't leave Jamari's face, as though he already knew who was responsible. Suddenly Jamari's chest tightened. The attention, the stares, the weight of the doctor's grave words pressed down on him. For the first time fear, not anger, rose in his heart. He realized this was no longer a problem he could hide behind closed doors. This was bigger, louder, and far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Do you want me to now expand Part 7, the news? The room seemed to hold its breath as the doctor finally spoke. His voice was steady, but the weight of his words made every heartbeat louder. Your wife has survived, but only just, he said firmly. The neighbors who had rushed Aaliyah and leaned forward, their eyes wide with worry. Jamari stood frozen, his fake confidence slipping away with every syllable. The doctor paused for a moment before continuing, his tone softening slightly. And there's something else you should know. Inside her womb there are not one but 2 heartbeats. She is carrying twins. Both are alive by nothing short of a miracle. Gasps filled the room. One of the women who had helped bring Aaliyah to the hospital covered her mouth with her hands, tears welling in her eyes. The man beside her whispered, "Twins!" as though he himself couldn't believe it. Everyone in the waiting area felt the shock ripple through them. What should have been joyful news was tangled in pain and disbelief, because they all knew what Aaliyah had just endured. Jamari's knees buckled, and he sank heavily into a chair. His face turned pale, his hands trembling against his thighs. The truth hit him like a storm. His rage, his fists, his cruelty. They had almost stolen not 1 but 3 lives. The image of his wife lying broken, her body shielding the tiny beings inside her, flashed in his mind, and for the first time, the weight of his actions pressed down on him with unbearable force. The doctor's words echoed in the air, refusing to fade. She survived, and so did your children. But you should know her strength is the only reason they are still here. Those words cut deeper than any blade. It wasn't Jamari's care that had kept them alive, it was Aaliyah's willpower, her fierce love as a mother. In that waiting room the world shifted. The story of cruelty had collided with the miracle of life, and no one who heard the news would ever forget the moment the truth shattered Jamari's mask forever. Do you want him? Jamari's body could no longer carry the weight of the doctor's words. His legs wobbled beneath him until they gave out completely, and he dropped into the nearest chair like a man who had just been struck by lightning. His chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths, his hands trembling uncontrollably. For the first time the mask he had worn so confidently slipped away, revealing not power, not charm, but weakness. His pride, the very thing that had fueled his rage, shattered in a single moment. He buried his face in his palms, but the images in his mind refused to leave him. He saw Aaliyah lying on the floor, broken because of him. He saw her hands wrapped desperately around her belly, trying to protect the innocent lives he hadn't even known existed. And now the knowledge that she was carrying twins, 2 children who had survived his violence by a miracle, struck him with a guilt so heavy he could barely breathe. People in the waiting room stared at him. Some shook their heads in disgust, others whispered to each other. For them it was clear now, the man who looked perfect in public was nothing more than a monster in private. Jamari could feel their judgment piercing him, but it was nothing compared to the storm raging inside his own chest. He trembled, his lips quivering, but no words came out. What excuse could possibly erase what he had done? What defense could he give against the truth that now stood naked before everyone? The chair beneath him felt like it was sinking, the air around him closing in. He had built his power on control, on silence, on fear. But in that hospital he had no control left. All he had was the unbearable truth. He had almost killed the woman who once loved him and the children he hadn't even met. And as his pride crumbled, so did the illusion of the man he thought he was. Jamari wasn't strong. He wasn't respected. He wasn't loved. He was broken, exposed, and collapsing under the weight of his own cruelty. Do you want me? On the hospital bed, Aaliyah slowly opened her eyes. The harsh light above her blurred, but the first thing she reached for was her stomach. Her trembling hands pressed gently against the curve of her belly, as if she needed to feel her children there, alive and safe. Tears streamed down her bruised face, but they were no longer just tears of pain. They carried relief, gratitude, and a fierce determination that no one could take away. She whispered softly, her voice weak but full of love. "My babies, you stayed with me. You're strong. You're fighters." Every word was a promise that she would never let them face the cruelty she had endured. For months she had been silent, living in fear, making excuses for the man who broke her. But now, lying there with life still beating inside her womb, something powerful began to rise within her. Her spirit, crushed under Jamari's anger, began to rebuild itself from the ashes of his cruelty. She realized she was no longer just a wife trying to save her marriage. She was a mother, and mothers fight differently. They fight with a strength that pain cannot destroy, with a love that fear cannot silence. Aaliyah knew she had survived not for herself alone, but for the two innocent souls who depended on her. She was their shield, their voice, their protector. As nurses moved around her, checking her vitals, she held onto her stomach and closed her eyes, whispering prayers over and over. "I will keep you safe. I will not fail you." Her voice was broken, but her spirit was unbreakable. The same woman who once lay on the floor unable to move now carried a new kind of strength, not from Jamari, not from anyone else, but from the unshakable love of a mother. And in that moment, even with her body still covered in bruises, Aaliyah knew she would rise again. This time not as a victim, but as the mother of two miracles. Do you want me to continue with Part 10, The Family's Intervention, 350 words? In the same emotional and dramatic word of what had happened spread quickly, and by the next morning, Aaliyah's family filled the corridors of Mukuru General Hospital. They had always trusted her smiles, believed her words when she said she was happy, and accepted the picture-perfect story she painted. But now, seeing her bruised body lying helpless on the hospital bed, all their silence turned into rage. Her mother's hands shook as she touched Aaliyah's swollen face, her tears falling onto her daughter's skin. Her brothers clenched their fists, their jaws tight with fury, and her father, a man of few words, stood at the doorway, his eyes burning with a quiet storm. When Jamari appeared in the corridor, their anger exploded. Gone was the respect they once showed him as their son-in-law. Her brothers stepped forward, blocking his path, their voices shaking with rage as they demanded answers. "How dare you put your hands on her? How dare you do this to our sister while she carries your children?" The nurses had to intervene to stop the confrontation from turning violent. Jamari, who once carried himself with arrogance, could barely lift his head. The stares of Aaliyah's family pierced through him like blades. For the first time he wasn't in control. He was surrounded, cornered, and exposed. The mask of charm he wore so easily had been ripped away, leaving only the cowardly truth of who he was. Her mother leaned close to him, her voice shaking but strong. "You nearly killed my daughter. And you nearly killed my grandchildren. You will never hurt her again." Her words echoed through the hallway, leaving no room for misunderstanding. For too long the family had been silent, believing Aaliyah's lies of safety. But now they stood like a wall, shielding her with a fury they should have shown long ago. And in that moment, Jamari realized the power he had over her was gone. He wasn't facing just Aaliyah anymore. He was facing an entire family ready to fight for her. Do you want me to continue with Pa? The day of the trial arrived, and the city of Tembra seemed to pause. People who had once admired Jamari now filled the courtroom, waiting to see the truth laid bare. Aaliyah, dressed in a simple gown, walked slowly into the chamber, her body still fragile but her spirit unshaken. Her bruises had faded into scars, yet each mark carried a story no one could deny. As she took her seat, whispers filled the room, whispers of sympathy, of anger, of disbelief that the man once praised as respectable was now standing in the dock as an accused criminal. The evidence spoke louder than Jamari ever could. The doctor stood firm, presenting medical reports that detailed the injuries Aaliyah had suffered: broken ribs, swelling, bruises deep across her body. The photographs were shown to the judge, each image burning into the hearts of those who saw them. And then came Aaliyah's voice. She didn't scream. She didn't cry for pity. She spoke simply, her words steady but heavy with truth. She told the court about the nights she prayed in silence, about the blows she endured, about how she feared not for her own life, but for the tiny ones growing inside her. Her tears flowed, but they were not tears of weakness. They were the tears of a survivor, of a mother who had endured what no woman should. Jamari tried to defend himself, mumbling excuses about losing control and a mistake, But no one believed him. The charm that once fooled neighbors held no power in a courtroom filled with undeniable truth. The judge's gavel came down hard, his voice declaring Jamari guilty. The weight of justice finally fell where it belonged. The city erupted with emotion. Some shook their heads in pity for Jamari, but most stood with Aaliyah. Her courage had turned private pain into public truth, and her silence into a voice that echoed across Tembera. That courtroom was no longer just about law. It became the stage where a woman's dignity rose higher than her abuser's cruelty. Do you want me to? After the trial, Aaliyah could have chosen to disappear quietly, to rebuild her life in silence. But she refused. Too many nights she had cried alone, too many times she had hidden her pain to protect Jamari's reputation, and too many women around her were still doing the same. So when the community leaders invited her to speak, she stood before them, her voice soft but unshakable. She told her story. Not with shame but with strength. She spoke about the fear of lying on the floor, about whispering prayers to her unborn children, about the pain of being hurt by the man who promised to love her. Her words pierced every heart in the room. Soon her story spread beyond Tembera. Local newspapers printed her testimony, and radio stations called her a voice for the silenced. In interviews, Aaliyah's message was always the same. Love should never hurt. No woman should suffer in silence. We deserve better. Her words became louder than Jamari's violence, reaching homes where women were still told to endure, and families who were still choosing silence over protection. Mothers began bringing their daughters to hear her speak. Young girls listened wide-eyed as she told them that their worth was greater than anyone's fists. Even men in the community began to nod in agreement, ashamed that they had once ignored what was happening behind closed doors. Marches were organized in her name. Posters painted with her image held high as crowds demanded an end to cruelty disguised as marriage. Through it all, Aaliyah never claimed to be a hero. She simply said she was a mother who survived, a woman who refused to stay quiet. But in the eyes of many, she was more than that. She became a living reminder that silence protects the abuser, while truth sets the victim free. And because she refused to stay silent, countless women began to find their voices too. Do you want me to continue with Part 13, The City That Took Sides, 350 words, in the same powerful emotional style? After the trial and Aaliyah's brave words, the city of Tembera couldn't ignore what had happened. Conversations that had once whispered behind closed doors now spilled into the streets. Some people shook their heads at Jamari, saying quietly, "He just lost control, anger gone too far." They pitied him, as if a man who had almost destroyed 2 lives deserved sympathy. But their voices were drowned out by a far louder chorus, the voices of those who stood with Aaliyah, who understood the courage it took to survive and speak the truth. Posters appeared across the city, painted with slogans like, "Love should never hurt," and "Protect women, protect children." People carried them high during marches, their chants echoing through neighborhoods that had once looked the other way. Women who had suffered in silence now raised their voices, walking shoulder to shoulder with mothers, sisters, and friends who refused to let abuse hide in the shadows. Men who had once ignored domestic violence joined in, clapping, chanting, and acknowledging that silence protects the abuser, not the victim. In markets, schools, and workplaces, conversations shifted. Friends stopped offering excuses for husbands or fathers who raised hands in anger. Instead, they shared Aaliyah's story, repeating the truth about bravery, survival, and justice. Small acts, helping a neighbor, speaking up during an argument, reporting violence, began to ripple across the city. Aaliyah's ordeal became more than a single story. It became a movement, a collective refusal to accept cruelty as part of marriage. Even Jamari, once a figure of charm and control, became a cautionary tale. He was no longer admired, no longer feared. He was a warning of what happens when anger and violence meet the wrong person. The city had taken sides, and its heart beat with Aaliyah's courage. Her name became a symbol, not of tragedy, but of change, hope, and the unstoppable power of one woman who refused to be silenced. Do you want? Months had passed since that terrifying night, and Aaliyah's body had healed, but her heart still carried the memory of every blow, every whispered prayer, every moment she had feared for her babies. When the day finally came for her to give birth, the hospital room was filled with quiet anticipation. Nurses moved quickly and efficiently, but Aaliyah barely noticed. All that mattered was the small lives she had fought so hard to protect. She clutched the hand of her mother, her eyes closed, whispering over and over, stay strong, Mama is here." And then the cries came. First one, then another. A sharp, urgent sound that cut through the room and filled it with life. Her twins, a boy and a girl, were both healthy, their tiny chests rising and falling with perfect rhythm. Aaliyah opened her eyes, tears streaming freely now, but these tears were different. They were tears of relief, of triumph, of love that had survived cruelty. She reached out, her hands shaking, and held her babies close. Their warmth, their tiny fingers curling around hers, erased the shadows of the past, if only for a moment. The nurses smiled, the doctors nodded, but Aaliyah barely noticed anything except the miracle in her arms. She whispered to them softly, promising to keep them safe, to protect them from the pain she had known. The room seemed to glow with a new light, one born not from bulbs or sunlight, but from survival and hope. Outside, news of the birth spread quickly. People who had followed her story rejoiced with her. She had faced cruelty, survived unimaginable fear, and now held not one, but 2 lives she had saved against all odds. In that moment, the woman who had once been broken by violence felt unbreakable. The cries of her children weren't just sounds, they were a declaration, a new beginning and proof that love and courage could overcome even the darkest moments. Do you want me to continue with part 15, The Woman Who Survived and Rose, 350 words, to compel? Aaliyah stepped out of the hospital holding her twins, her body still carrying faint scars of what she had endured, but her spirit radiating strength no one could take away. The woman who had once lain on the cold floor, trembling and afraid, was gone. In her place stood a mother, a survivor, a force of nature who had fought through pain, fear, and cruelty to claim her life and protect the 2 innocent souls she loved more than anything. Her steps were steady, her head held high, and her eyes glimmered with a fierce pride that no one, not even Jamari, could ever diminish. Jamari was no longer part of her story. The man who had struck, shouted, and broken her confidence had been exposed for what he truly was. The city knew him now not as a charming husband, but as a warning, a shadow of a life that could have destroyed Aaliyah and her children if not for her courage. He was forgotten in the light of what she had survived, a distant memory that only highlighted her strength. Her story, however, refused to be silent. Across Tembra, women shared it with friends and neighbors, mothers told it to daughters, and community groups celebrated it as a symbol of hope. She had shown that no matter how deep the pain, how heavy the fear, or how cruel the person who stands in your way, survival is possible. Courage is possible. Love is stronger than hate, and a mother's will is stronger than any violence. Holding her twins close, Aaliyah whispered promises to them, her voice calm but unshakable. She would protect them, guide them, and show them a world full of hope. Every step she took was a lesson for everyone who heard her story. A lesson that strength grows from survival, that justice can be won, and that even in the darkest moments, a life rebuilt with courage and love can shine brighter than anyone ever imagined. The woman who had once been broken now rose fully, a living testament that pain does not define us, but the courage to rise above it does. Her life, her child,